The Iranian government is waging a brutal crackdown on protesters who are calling for cultural freedom and political change.
Iran has been in a state of upheaval for weeks due to protests, but now the government is ramping up its efforts to quash dissent. Daily Wire investigative reporter Mairead Elordi is here with the details for us. So, Mairead, what's the latest on these protests?
Hi, Georgia. Well, the latest is pretty disturbing. The Iranian government is cracking down extremely hard on these protesters, many of whom are young teenagers. Protesters are often beaten and detained in jail. Some have been beaten after they were taken into custody. Others have been shot and killed in the streets.
Now, Iran has had political unrest in the past. What sparked this round of protests?
These demonstrations began after the September death of a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini. Amini was arrested and detained by Iran's religious morality police for not wearing a hijab properly. Women who were arrested with her say she was severely beaten by police and she died days later in a Tehran hospital. In the weeks since Amini's death, some female protesters have publicly cut their hair or refused to wear the hijab during the demonstrations. In fact, the protests have been largely led by women. Essentially, they're demanding freedom from Iran's clerical rule.
Now, how large are these protests?
These protests are reportedly more widespread than the political protests Iran saw in 2009, 2017, and 2019. Iran has already arrested more than 14,000 people and charged at least 1,000 with crimes in the Tehran province. Protesters have marched in the streets around the country daily since September 16th. They've scuffled with law enforcement and allegedly set fire to government buildings. Over the weekend, authorities sentenced the first person to death over the protests, convicting the person of enmity against God and spreading corruption on earth, according to state media. According to the group Iran Human Rights, Iran's security forces have killed at least 326 protesters since the demonstrations began 2 months ago. Also, earlier this month, a majority of Iran's parliament wrote a letter to the judiciary calling for protesters to be taught a good lesson and face harsh punishments, which could include the death penalty.
Now, you mentioned that many of the protesters are young. Are the Iranian police dealing with them differently because of that, or are they cracking down just as hard?
No, the police seem to be treating the teen protesters just as harshly as the adults. The average age of the protesters is about 15, and Iran's youth have been particularly harmed in this crackdown, according to lawyers and human rights activists. Authorities have even raided schools and beaten students to death, including a 15-year-old girl. One extremely disturbing development being reported by CNN and the BBC is that many women and girls involved in the women's rights protests appear to have been violently raped in police custody. Police apparently commit sexual violence on protesters as young as 13 or 14 as a way to discourage the demonstrations.
So a very violent approach from the Iranian police. Mairead, thanks for reporting.
Thanks, Georgia.
That was Daily Wire investigative reporter Mairead Elordi. As the fentanyl crisis makes national headlines, an additional layer to the tragedy is now clear.
The combination of fentanyl with other drugs, such as methamphetamine, is creating a new overdose crisis. Here with more information is Daily Wire's Charlotte Pence-Bond. So, Charlotte, the crisis worsens. What's the latest on this?
Well, the latest is even more grim. The CDC says more than 150 people die every day from overdoses related to synthetic opioids, including fentanyl. And now there's an increasing amount of overdoses that are being caused by a combination of multiple drugs. Last year, 20% of the total fatal overdoses included an opioid like fentanyl and a psychostimulant like meth. That's according to preliminary federal information. But 10 years before that, those combos only made up around 2% of fatal overdoses. But of course, using any of these drugs on their own poses serious health risks and even death. Meth can lead to deadly heart damage, hallucinations, and erratic actions. Last year, around 2/3 of people who died while using psychostimulants also had opioids in their system. But that isn't always intentional. Sometimes the drug they buy is laced, or there's cross-contamination where it's made.
And are we seeing an increase in overdose deaths across the board?
Yes, federal data shows that last year around 33,400 deaths involved psychostimulants, which was an increase of more than 340% from 5 years before. In the same amount of time, fatalities involving synthetic opioids increased 270%, and total drug fatalities also went up 71%. As psychostimulant deaths have gone up, so have deaths that also involved opioids. And last year, around 75% of meth-related fatalities in the state of North Carolina also involved fentanyl. Meth and fentanyl use have both surged across the country and are spreading into new regions. For example, drug traffickers are pushing meth into the Northeast, and fentanyl availability is increasing in western states where meth once dominated.
Now, we've seen that fentanyl is spreading beyond border states, but what are the numbers now on the border in terms of trafficking?
We're just seeing more and more fentanyl smuggled across the border. For example, a Mexican man was recently sentenced to prison for his involvement with an attempted smuggling of meth and fentanyl. The seizure was the country's biggest for each drug for the calendar years 2021 and 2022 as of last month. The trafficking attempt included over 17,000 pounds of meth and about 389 pounds of fentanyl. This month, border officers found 26 pounds of meth and 10 pounds of fentanyl in El Paso in the same smuggling effort. Port Director Ray Provencio said that it's not normal to find huge quantities of two different hard drugs, but dual smuggling is becoming more common. As of October, Border Patrol had seized over 1,000 pounds of fentanyl since the start of this fiscal year. That's a 200% increase from the last year. And while fentanyl seizures are more of a recent trend, the inflow of meth has been a problem for much longer.
Well, let's hope we see some progress on this crisis soon. Charlotte, thanks for reporting.
Thanks for having me.
That was Daily Wire's Charlotte Pence-Bond.